Hi, you're watching Bread and Roses, a weekly political social TV magazine. I'm Maryam Namazie, and I'm presenting this week's program with my wonderful co-host Bahram Soroush.
Hello.
And Fariborz Pooya.
Hi.
In this week's program, we're going to be discussing the Burka ban in France, and we'd like to discuss it and see what you think about it as well. Obviously, some will say that it's discriminatory. From my perspective, I think it's a very good thing to ban something that completely erases a woman and dehumanizes her. I mean, in a sense, I would think it's similar to the disappeared of Argentina, you know, the burqa, and this type of complete covering of women is a way of disappearing the woman altogether. We'll be interviewing Gita Sahgal from the Center for Secular Space. She's got a lot of interesting points on this issue. She, in fact, was the head of Amnesty International's gender unit, and she was fired because of her opposition to Amnesty International's relationship with caged prisoners, which is an Islamist organization. And of course, as we have every week, we're going to have an insane fatwa of the week. Anyway, before we go into our discussions, let's listen to a short background clip on this issue. Stay with us. Don't go away. The European Court of Human Rights has upheld France's ban on wearing full face veils in public, rejecting arguments that the ban undermines freedoms of religion and expression. The French government has said that the ban helps to protect public safety, as well as women forced to wear face-covering garments, but opponents have criticized it as anti-Muslim and discriminating against religious minorities. Now, the thing that's very interesting for me is the fact that something that is completely a pro-women's rights act, you know, that defends the woman vis-a-vis a religious dogma that says she needs to be covered up and she's the source of fitna and chaos if she's not, can be seen to be discriminatory. Sometimes I think it's quite a topsy-turvy world we live in, where banning something that actually discriminates against women becomes discriminatory. Go figure.
I think you're right. There's always, when you want to bring some change and you need to actually improve on the current situation, you have to, society decides that they need to actually ban certain practices, slavery, child abuse, punishment of children, smoking in an enclosed sort of environment where there are children around. There are people who always argue that because this ban is restricting individuals' freedom. That's not the case in all circumstances. As I said, for example, banning slavery is good for the health of society. It's terrible for humans to be slaves. So banning it is quite appropriate and the right thing to do. In the same way with banning burqa, that it restricts humanity of half of the society, it's good for society. So I have no problem actually arguing that case. And there are many people, Islamists actually use the terms within sort of, you know, the terminology and language of posing themselves as against the ban and restrictions.
As if they're the ones who are liberal and pro-rights.
Absolutely, and I think this is important for society to recognise not everything which is banned is bad.
No, I mean, definitely. I mean, I think that's an important point, that a lot of the fights for changes in society have been for changes in the law, very often to, in fact, restrict things that are violating people's rights. And what could be worse than, you know, demanding that a woman be covered from head to toe?
I mean, when we're talking about burqa, like hijab, in general, it's not a piece of cloth. It's got two functions. One, it's a symbol of women's oppression. I mean, why is this dress code about women only, first? And the other thing is, it is the banner of a political movement, political Islamic movement, which is being pushed, you know, for certain women to wear, being forced to wear the niqab, the, you know, hijab, everything, in order to Islamicize society and to strengthen, you know, this reactionary, you know, political Islamic movement. So it is not an innocuous piece of clothing that we should bring in the argument of free speech into, as we would talk about different kinds of, you know, different colors of clothing that everybody has the right to wear, the amount of clothing, everything. So in this particular case, I welcome it as well. I think it sets an important precedent, and it sends a good message. And it's sad that it's only in France that this sort of legislation has been passed.
I mean, in a sense, what the woman's wearing underneath is her clothing, so it's not even really the right to dress. And even the movement for the right to dress has always been a challenge very often to religion, which prescribed a certain dress for women, to be covered and so on and so forth. Now very often that same movement is defending the right to wear the burqa, and it doesn't see the fact that it's actually a restriction, and a real women's rights movement, a liberation movement, would be opposed to it, as they are in Iran and many other places.
No, absolutely. I think this is quite a salient point, Maryam, because in countries where Islamic governments are in power, they're not fighting for freedom of dress for women. They're imposing it by law, by harsh sentences and punishment. Where they are not in position to actually enforce that, they hang on to the question of banning freedom of expression and try to push the same agenda through sort of legal channel. But in reality, it's the same group of people who, as soon as they get into power, the violent basic human rights and enforce it with brute force. And that's why it's important to recognize, as Bahram said, this is a banner of a political movement and needs to be stopped.
Yeah, I mean, definitely when you look at the imposition of the burqa, and it is an imposition, in many societies it's completely alien to the populations that are forced to wear it. ISIS now, in areas that it's taken control of, it's imposing the burqa on women. Let's go and listen to an interview now with Gita Sahgal. It's a really wonderful interview. It is 20 minutes, but it's worth listening. And there's facts in there about the human rights movement, and in particular Amnesty International, and its outlook on this issue of veiling that is really interesting. So don't go away, stay with us, and we'll be back to discuss it further. Hello, Gita Sahgal. Welcome to our program. I wanted to ask you about the recent European Human Rights Court's upholding of France's banning of the face veil. Do you think it was a good move?
I think it was an excellent decision. I'm not sure if I agree with every detail of how it was argued, but overall, I think it was a good decision. And the reason I think it's a good decision, and a decision in fact in defense of human rights, as opposed to all the major human rights organizations who've condemned it, is that there is no appetite at all anywhere that I can see among the major Western human rights organizations to examine violence, murder, coercion in the name of the veil. They have, Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International have not produced reports on that issue.
We just hear about how it's a choice and a right, basically.
Exactly. We hear about the other side a lot, and we have a succession of women who are probably political Islamists going to court to defend their right to wear the veil. The only cases I know that have been taken against forced veiling, there was a case in Bangladesh that Sarah Hussain took, I think to the Supreme Court in Bangladesh, and got a judgment against forced veiling. But it's human rights activists in parts of the world that are most affected by veiling who see that. So again, you see in Iran, we have a report recently come out on sexuality and human rights issues, which looks at mandatory gender reassignment and mandatory veiling as a problem. And I know that the Iranian feminists who've done that work are very concerned that the human rights organizations actually tried to silence them on this.
I mean, I don't think you're surprised, obviously, with the response of the human rights groups. You yourself was head of the gender unit at Amnesty International, and you were suspended and forced to leave because of your, your opposition to Amnesty's relationship with caged prisoners, which is an Islamist organization. And I know you've had debates with them on the veil. What was that like?
Well, when I was head of the gender unit, we were running a major campaign on stop violence against women all around the world. And the issue of veiling kept coming up. Now, where did it keep coming up? It was the Turkey team that kept coming to us and say, you have to produce a statement that is against forced, against a ban on the hijab. And they were very, very strong on this. And I, at that time, I mean, I'm not really in favor of the state telling people how to dress. So when I say that this was a good judgment of the European Court on Human Rights, it's because we have a terrible situation in Europe where there is not a single body that I know of, except for bodies like ours, which are small and not very well funded and new. But except for people like the Council for Ex-Muslims or the Center for Secular Space, the major well-funded human rights organizations are all taking positions that are pro-Islamism and supporting the women who want to wear the veil and refusing. I know instances at Amnesty where researchers offered to research instances where women were given money to wear niqab and things like that. They were told not to do it. When I gathered all the researchers together who work on issues around the veil, or weren't working on them, but where I expected it to be a problem, we discussed the human rights of veiling and whether, you know, we had a sort of sitting on the fence, but, you know, it's wrong to force dress on either side. The Saudi Arabian and the Iran team said that the human rights framework permitted the state to enforce veiling. The Turkey team, where the Turkish state, as far as I know, doesn't put people in jail, it is quite harsh. It's ban on the hijab, used to be, but it had administrative measures. You know, it didn't whip people or put them in jail. So they wanted to take a stand and thought it was a human rights issue and should be researched. The Saudi Arabia and Iran team did not. And in fact, as I said, many other groups silenced people who were trying to work on it. When you have that happening, for instance, one of the things we're told is there might be racism against people. Now, I think there is racism against women who wear visibly Muslim dress. There are anti-Muslim attacks on such women. Those attacks have to be unequivocally condemned, because whether we like people or like their dress or not, obviously we don't support any form of assault on them. But there are numerous organizations that do monitor these attacks and do take them on board. On the veiling, the forced veiling issue, there's nobody. You know, I've tried to work with the police and tried to get them to take on board the issue of people being atheists, being attacked for being labeled atheists, that this is actually a form of death threat. The police don't listen to that. Nobody, none of the human rights organizations have looked seriously at the issue of coercion. They just mention it in passing, and they don't mention the considerable literature that comes from people like us that talks about the fact that women could be raped for not wearing it, they can be beaten up, they can be arrested, they can be whipped.
And in a sense, that's the experience of a vast majority of people. It's not the other way around, is it?
Yeah, and there's not a single place where they can go when that happens to them. So if you're going to, and I don't think you make a choice between racism or sexism, you have to deal with both. But the fact is that where you have a ban, it protects particularly children. It protects younger people from being forced into it. And the state is then, or people who want to challenge the enforced veiling can take this issue up. Because you can be damn sure that the human rights organizations are not going to produce teams that monitor this kind of thing. There's a hilarious, I mean, it's funny, it make you weep, but we have to laugh because we really can't weep about these things. We'd be weeping all the time. There was an amicus brief presented by a human rights research body I think from Ghent University in Belgium. And they said, we wanted to look at the impact of this ban on women who choose to wear the veil. And they interviewed 27 women. And they said, we are sure that none of them are coerced. Why are they sure that none of them are coerced? Because they said, we asked them, and they said, Islam doesn't allow coercion, therefore we're sure none of them are coerced. This is presented as a serious piece of human rights research.
I mean, the thing is, you know, I guess their major argument is that it's the right to dress. And I know there's a lot of contestation on the veil in the Middle East, North Africa, in many communities, and particularly the face veil. I mean, this is what the ban is really about. It's the face veil and the niqab or the burqa. Is it a right to dress? And what's the difference between having the right to religion and then the right to manifest it? I mean, that's not absolute, is it?
There's three things, actually. One is that the right to manifest is not absolute. It's a right that can be tempered for all sorts of reasons. And in fact, for reasons of security is one of the main, health and security, both of which come under this wearing of the niqab all the time. And what you have to try and read into the reasons for limitation is also gender discrimination. It's very significant that the way in which Human Rights Watch and other groups talk about the veil is that they only talk about if you're offended, you don't have the right to stop it. I'm not talking about people being offended. I'm not interested if somebody doesn't like it. That's not the point. The point is, it's a flag of political identity, and that political identity is a threat to others. It puts other women at threat. It makes them, I've worked with women who wear the hijab, and we were sitting in Southall actually, in a community center, and suddenly some right-wing Muslim fundamentalist group was having a meeting there, and all the women who arrived in busloads were in niqab. So it was some very far-right group. And it was a woman, I mean, I was appalled by that meeting, and if they'd been white fascists, we'd immediately have gone and opposed them, but we kept quiet because they were Muslims. But the woman who was most threatened was a woman who was already very covered, who said, oh my God, you know, it makes me feel naked, and she felt most directly under threat. They can't force me to wear it, but they can put her in a position where she's a bad Muslim if she doesn't wear it.
And it's interesting when you hear the arguments for this right to dress. You know, they use language where it says that women have a right to choose over their own bodies, and it's using that sort of women's liberation
feminist language
as a way of actually restricting women, because that's what the veil is in a sense.
Exactly, and that's what's so perverse. And it's an example of how appalling the human rights bodies are on the issue of women's human rights. They do not actually believe that women are full subjects of human rights, and therefore they refuse to investigate classic violations of human rights, where the state interferes with women's bodies to the extent that it says that women must be made invisible in public space. And because it's a twin thing. They, on the one hand, refuse to do that work. On the other hand, they aggressively promote Islamist women's rights in public spaces in Europe. And I think it's a form that we're seeing it extensively in Britain in the work that you've been doing and the campaigning with Southall Black Sisters on universities, UK, and gender segregation, on the Law Society and their wills judgment, and in the attitude that the human rights bodies take towards Islamists as their partners and friends and peoples whose ideologies that they seek to promote through their human rights work. I think this is a form of institutionalized Islamism.
Yeah, explain that more, because I think that's a new term. But in a sense, it explains very perfectly what's going on.
I think institutionalized Islamism is similar to institutionalized racism, which a lot of people who worked in anti-racist movements began to look at what was happening to institutions like the police, like the courts, various parts of the state and so on. The point was not whether an individual carried in his or her head racist thoughts, whether they individually hated black people and they wanted to do them down or beat them up. Of course, the police frequently did all those things. They invented cases, they were corrupt, they stopped and searched excessively, etc., etc. All that happens. However, the important leap was that it's not just the mind of the individual, it's the effect of a set of policies on the way in which the institution functions. That mean that, for instance, fewer people with the right qualifications will get employed if they're black. That people won't have chances. That basically they'll be discriminated against as well as coerced and beaten up and so on. And that is a form of racism, which is a racism that's embedded in the institution. And I think that's what's happening in Britain, that Islamist ideologies are embedding themselves in major institutional forms, and regardless of whether the individual, if you ask them, do you think the Muslim Brotherhood are great, or do you think it's okay for women to have half the witness of men, or whatever, they may say, oh, no, we don't think that's acceptable. Or at any rate, they say, we don't think that's acceptable for us. There's, of course, a group of people that are saying, if they want it, that's fine. It's their choice. And promoting what they call minority legal orders, somebody like Maliha Malik. And so on. So they're working with the state to actually promote vicious forms of Islamism, while themselves appearing to be utterly liberal and conforming to human rights norms.
So going back to the issue of the veil, I mean, do you think all forms of religious dress should be banned? Or is it mainly on the issue of niqab or burqa? How does it work?
You see, I don't think, and that's why I've really struggled with this issue of the veil, because I don't think all forms of religious dress should be banned. whether I like them or not, I think that actually mostly the state should not be allowed to interfere with the way people are. So it's only where everything else has failed, and I think that's really the reason that it becomes a danger in itself. I think anybody who's coerced, like a Sikh man who's coerced into wearing a turban, should not be so coerced. But I don't think the wearing of a turban in itself is a signal of coercing the rest of society. You know, I don't think it's a danger to others. I think there is a threat within the community of that kind of internal coercion. But I don't think they constitute a danger. Similar with the kippah or, you know, many other forms, or many forms of dress. I mean, I dress very conservatively in general, and I often wear some kind of scarf around my shoulders, which is more normal in South Asia than always over the head, and so on. And I don't necessarily want to have to wear a suit. I may choose to wear a suit like you're wearing today, but I don't have to want to wear one out of sheer conformity. So I think people should be tolerant of a wide variety of dress. But I think the niqab really demands an exception to any form of masking. And I think that's the point that Taj Harge has made to you, you know, when he was speaking on a platform with you, that it is a form of mask. And it's therefore it's not only dangerous to other women, and I think all forms of hijab do carry that danger, because they're telling women, they make a fetish of the hair, they say you have to cover it, otherwise you are a danger to men. And it's your fault if anything happens to you. So I think not all forms of religious dress are sending that kind of message. The hijab in all its forms is sending that kind of message.
Do you see a link between the whole rise in the wearing of the burqa, Sharia courts, gender segregation at universities? Do you see that all as part of some sort of, Islamist power struggle in a sense? Because I think one of the problems is that people see them all in isolation and don't necessarily see them all as related to some extent.
I think
even with the rise of the large number of British fighters with ISIS now in Iraq and Syria.
Yeah.
Do you see links between these or not?
I think they are linked because they're part of an agenda of political Islam. I think it's important to remember that many forms of fundamentalism think that dress codes of women are absolutely central to their being. So all over Africa, for instance, you find there are Christian evangelical groups that are attacking women for wearing trousers. They want extreme sex differentiation. So you actually have gangs going out in the Democratic Republic of Congo, sometimes backed by certain churches, saying that we'll, cut off women's jeans if they're going seen wearing jeans. There was a woman in Nigeria killed for wearing trousers. So it's a serious issue. And then, of course, trousers are banned in Sudan and so on. So there was Lubna al-Hussein, who was very bravely, wore trousers to court after she was arrested for wearing trousers. The Hindu fundamentalists also try and impose dress codes. They say women have to wear saris, or they have to wear bindis, or they can't wear jeans in college and so on. So, that it's not as harsh and as similar. And it's not as weird, the dress code, in the sense that it may be a form of dress that people wear along the way. What's interesting about the niqab and the modern forms of hijab they are an anti-culture, which is not what people traditionally wore. And therefore, it's the most extreme dress code. And in fact, when we've said to Islamist women, oh, you're not wearing traditional dress, they say, we don't wear traditional dress, we're modern women. We wear modern Islamic dress. They're very proud of the fact that it's actually anti-cultural and that it's not what their grandmothers were in anything from, mini skirts to saris, or, depending where they came from. They wore a huge range of different kinds of clothes. But these women are saying, no, we want to be completely covered, and that shows that we're wearing Islamic dress. So it's worst among Muslim fundamentalists, but Orthodox Jews, there's been an increasing attempt to force women to cover their arms. Little girls, have been attacked for not having their arms covered, and to segregate buses. So the issue of gender segregation and extreme dress codes that, in a way, put a circle around women go together. And they go together with attacks on women in public spaces. So again, you have the example of Hindu fundamentalists who burst into bars where drinking is legal in India. It's not even that it was being done under the counter. It's a Bangalore, city full of bars, city full of working women who go out on their own and drink if they choose to. And they attacked women in a bar. And then the women formed a group of loose drinking loose women who drink and something. There was something like that on the Facebook page.
Oh, yeah, that's
yes.
fantastic.
And they also sent pink underpants to all these men who were imposing dress codes. So hundreds of women, thousands of women sent pink underpants to this group.
Sometimes that's the best type of challenge.
I think that's the
isn't it?
best type of thing to do. Is they really should be challenged. You know, even making these what I now see as ridiculous human rights statements that just say we don't want, you know, coercion this way, we don't want coercion that way. It's failing to look at the forms of coercion. It's a cop-out because they're not equal. They're absolutely not equal. The coercion of forcing somebody to wear a veil, whether it's done in the community or done by the state in Iran or Saudi Arabia, is one set of things. And the women who say we choose to and our rights and freedoms are being restricted are wearing an ugly flag of political identity, and they're demanding an exception. They're using religion to say it's an exception to the normal practices which would stop, you know, where they would not be allowed to walk around with face masks. So, I mean, you know, I would prefer the mask to be banned, but if the niqab is banned specifically as a niqab, I think that's also allowable because it is a form of danger. It's a signal that other women are fair game to be raped. That's what the signal is. The woman wearing it is saying, I'm pure, but you can be raped. And that's not about offense. That is a signal of, it's a form of hate speech.
Thank you, Gita.
Thank you.
I hope you enjoyed Gita's interview. I think she makes a really important point that you may not necessarily agree with all the reasons that the French government has given on this ban. I don't. I don't think security is one of the main issues or even the issue of communication. But for me, it's women's rights. And I think people should oppose the burqa and defend a burqa ban based on women's rights. Let's now go to, of course, the insane fatwa of the week. Drum rolls, please. And this week we've got another insane fatwa. It's by Dr. Youssef Eid, who is secretary of the Fatwa Committee of Al-Azhar. And in an interview with Mohit Network, he said that zakat, which is the sort of charitable giving, it's mandatory in Islam. It's only $1. I don't know where he got that figure from. And if you don't do it, you're a sinner. But if you refuse to give it, then you should be fought and killed by the ruler, as it's a pillar of Islam. So it's really hilarious. It's like even the charities, if you don't do it, you die. Everything in Islam seems to be, if you don't do it, you end up dead.
And also, it's quoted in dollar because it's linked to exchange rate mechanism. I think that's quite important. I think the other thing is that this is extortion. Yeah. These Islamic organizations who actually function basically extorting money from population, that's another thing. I mean, the fact that it's punishable by death, apparently, according to this mad fatwa doctor, this is amazing, and I think it's just funniest thing I've heard recently.
Another case in point, that they really love death, you know, blood and coercion, everything, you know, that's part and parcel of that, even when it comes to something charitable.
Yes, even in Islam, even being charitable, if you don't do it, you die. I hope you enjoyed this week's program. Do tell us what you think about it. We really love to hear from you. And we look forward to doing these programs. We hope to do many, many more. And we hope you will stay and listen with us and tell other people about us. Our hits are getting much larger. We know we're getting seen in Iran as well. So we're really happy about that, and we want to keep having your support. We hope you have a good week, and until next week, have a great week, and we'll see you again. Goodbye.